This is another one of my translations by the Spanish historian and theologian Damian Galeron. This is in the form of an interview. This interview is dated the 13th of July 2022. He starts off by saying that there is a law in physics which is called the law of acceleration, which states that when an object is in motion and when it's accelerating, its movement is greatest towards the end. In other words, it goes at its fastest at the very end. This, he says, we can now apply it to what's happening geopolitically in our world. Things are accelerating at an alarming rate at the moment. 50 or 60 years ago, you lived in a place and very little happened there. But at the moment, it's almost impossible to keep up with events that are happening so quickly. In the last few days, a number of people rang me to inform me that Benedict had died. I told them straight away that that's an impossibility because the prophecies have to be fulfilled, and the prophecy with regarding Benedict is very, very clear. Benedict will not die in Rome, he will die outside Rome in another country. The time that we have left now is very, very short, and we need to really be preparing ourselves now. The situation in Europe now is very complicated. Putin has said that he is going to cut off the gas to Europe. This is really big news, and I hope people understand it. This is huge. This means that Europe is going to freeze with the cold this winter. Then we have the situation in the Ukraine. Well, we all know that that's just a smoke screen. We all know what's happening, and what is actually happening is that the big powers are preparing for an attack on Russia. But Russia will defend itself. What really worries me is the autumn in the Northern Hemisphere. Because the information that I have at the moment, which comes from very high-ranking people, and this information tells us that at the very end of September into October, everything starts to fall apart. First of all, we will be looking at the financial collapse, and then of course we have the food scarcity that will be setting in around the same time. I'm always talking about the problems that there are going to be with the food supply, and I have to keep harping on that. But I also want to state that there is so much food in the world that it could feed all of humanity a number of times over. But this is a created shortage. This is not real whatsoever. This is created by them. However, we see the prices of foodstuffs going up everywhere. In most countries now we witness this. So why is this actually happening? It's happening because the governments, the various governments, are telling the producers and the manufacturers of different types of foods that they scale back or cut production completely. They have done this in order to increase the prices and to create a greater crisis. The governments themselves have been told to do this by the global elite. The whole idea is to produce an artificial famine, and in that way to kill off the people. At the same time, of course, they will be killing off the people that have taken all the different types of jabs. And we could add to that a big long etc. All other ways of killing people. This is what they want. In other words, we now find ourselves in the middle of a panorama that is very, very complex. I was talking a few days ago to a military man of extremely high rank, and I told him that NATO and the US will be able to do absolutely nothing to Putin, but in actual fact that Putin will tear them apart. He told me that the global elite are completely mistaken in believing that they can win against Putin. But he says that they fight to the death between themselves. These are the very people, he said, that are now destroying our world. But even among themselves, they are fighting to the death because they can't even agree on what policies to follow. We have Joe Biden, for instance, US President, making statements that Russia won't even last 5 minutes. We also have the head of NATO, Stoltenberg, who think they'll be finished with Russia in a few hours. There definitely is something wrong with all of these people. Do they not understand that Russia could finish all of them in 6 or 7 hours? Russia has the capacity at the moment to wipe them off the map in just a few hours, and they don't seem to realise that. So this is all part of the crisis that I'm talking about. An economic crisis, famine, the state of the church. Personally, I situate all of these different aspects in the critical months of October and November of this year. That is when I see them happening. And it is precisely in these 2 months of October and November that we come to the end of another cycle of blood moons. So what's the panorama therefore? Obviously we could sin a little bit as regards being pessimistic about the whole thing. However, some time ago a friend of mine said that a pessimist is a person who's very well informed. The question here is not that we're trying to be pessimistic, but what we're trying to do is to be realistic, to see what's really happening, to understand what's happening on the ground. So the big question really for us is, what are we going to do when confronted with all of this? And it's here that we have to go into our inside. We have to strengthen our spiritual life. We have to strengthen and pay close attention to our prayer lives. We have to make a very generous offering, or surrender if you like, of our hearts and our minds to Almighty God. A very practical way of doing all of this, of course, is to be good towards our neighbour, to be surrendered towards our neighbour, and to do the best we can to help him in these times. The situation that we find ourselves in today in this world makes it such that we now have to give a fundamental response to God. A yes to God or a yes to Satan. It's one or the other. It might help us here to remember, of course, the time that the apostles were in the boat and Christ was asleep in the stern. And Saint Peter said to Christ, Lord, he says, do you not care that we drown? So obviously Christ is not going to allow us to drown. But of course that will be an individual matter for each one of us and how we respond to God with generosity. He is then asked a question about quite a sizable number of people who have lost all their money in one of the Chinese banks. And he says, all of these things, he says, they're going to come to haunt us as well. If we remember back, he said, when COVID hit China, within a week, all the restrictions related to COVID were being imposed on all the different populations of the West, he says. So once again, it's going to happen the same way with the money thing and the banks. Very soon we're going to see all these banks collapsing one by one. The symptoms are there already. And Argentina needs to take note, because there are going to be huge convulsions happening in Argentina. And what happens in Argentina very shortly is going to be in the rest of Europe. But anyway, let's enjoy these 3 months, these 3 months that we have got. Let's make the most out of them before we have to face up to what's coming. In other words, let's enjoy these few months of peace that we have, these last 2 or 3 months of peace that we have before the hurricane faces us. In a lot of South American countries now, we have the global elite putting people into power who haven't won elections at all. All of these elections are completely fraudulent. The biggest example probably is Bolsonaro in Brazil. I have absolutely no doubt that if Bolsonaro presents himself for election in Brazil, he will win by a complete landslide. But that's not going to happen, because the crowd at the top will make sure that he doesn't get in. They will put in their own person. We have seen exactly the same thing happen in Colombia. It's not that the Colombian people voted for Petro, but that the global elite managed to swing things in his direction. If you look up the internet, you will find that there's an Italian priest by the name of Don Orione, Orione, who made a load of prophecies about Argentina. This man lived in Argentina for years, and it's incredible reading when you read this. Then you will see what's going to happen to Argentina. At this point he's asked, why will all of these things happen in Argentina? And he says, I'd like to explain that by explaining something that's a very delicate topic to deal with. But it's the topic of witchcraft and the occult. He says it's impossible to understand the rise of Nazism in Germany just before the Second World War unless we understand the role of witchcraft in National Socialism. Because practically all of the German High Command practiced witchcraft, including Hitler. I don't have any proof of this in the case of Rudolf Hess, who actually was sent to England to negotiate peace with Britain. So it's not just enough that we understand the role of politics and economics in the German situation, but we also have to understand the role of the occult and witchcraft. And practically all of the German High Command, including Hitler, practiced witchcraft and Satanism. This is one of the aspects of the German situation that nobody ever studies. Nobody goes there. It's all politics or economics or similar subjects. But nobody touches on this spiritual aspect of the problem. We have the same problem with Venezuela in the time of Chavez. It would be pointless to study the situation in Venezuela unless we take into account the amount of witchcraft and Satanism that was being practiced there. I myself, when I lived in Venezuela a good number of years ago, I lived there for a year, I was absolutely astounded at the amount of Satanism and witchcraft that was being practiced there by practically everybody. Therefore, of course, Venezuela had its problems with the oil and Chavez, etc., etc. But it also, behind all of this, there was a severe problem with this spiritual aspect. This spiritual battle was going on. This is exactly what's happening now in Argentina. All of us, therefore, are facing a spiritual battle, a huge spiritual battle. Of course, we're living an economic crisis and a political crisis, and we have the problem with Francis. The things that are happening in the Vatican, the attempt to say that Benedict has died. And behind all these things, we have the fact that there exists an ongoing spiritual battle being fought. But this spiritual battle is being fought through the medium of politics and economics. For example, regarding the Spanish government, the majority of Spanish MPs practice the occult and Satanism. The majority. I am not going to quote names, but I can tell you that the majority of the Spanish government is overwhelmingly satanic. We know that in these places and in the IMF, etc., all of these places, they absolutely detest everything that has to do with Catholicism, and they're doing their utmost to destroy it. This is self-evident. We are seeing this now with abortion. We are seeing it with euthanasia. We are seeing it with all the persecutions that we are now coming under. All of this constitutes a spiritual war, and it's the last spiritual war that we're ever going to encounter. The interviewer then brings up a point. He's quoting some source, some religious source, of a person that said that very soon these extraterrestrials are going to arrive on Earth, particularly over the most populated cities in the world, and they're going to present us a super powerful tablet that will cure all the ills that we have been exposed to up to now. So his question for Galeron basically is, what do you think of this? Galeron answers by saying, yeah, he says, we're going to see this. We're going to see hundreds of thousands, if not millions, of these spacecrafts arrive. This is part, he says, of the agenda of the global elite. But he also says that despite all of these, and there are thousands or millions indeed of spacecrafts that are going to appear, he says we must understand that 90% of them are going to be holograms. But he says they will have a tremendous sense of reality. They will look perfectly real. All of these things, he says, form part of what's called Project Bluebeam. So he says, so what's the purpose of all of these beings arriving to our Earth? He says they have come here really, he says, to support this other person who is what we will call the Antichrist. He says, I think I told you already, actually you'll find this in my last translation, about the meeting, the teleconferencing meeting that I was invited to, that was attended by 5 generals, 7 colonels, 2 public prosecutors, and a judge. And during that meeting, there was one of the people there who was tremendously well informed. As I said, these people were all top military people from a certain country. I cannot give names and I cannot tell you what the country is because that would be outside of my remit. But I can tell you that this person, who knew a great deal, told us that this individual would come in the middle of 2023 and that this man would control the entire world, all the nations of the world. He would control the politics, the economics, and all of the religions. So that gives us some kind of an idea of where we are now in history, with the appearance of this Antichrist. And all of these aliens, call them what you like, extraterrestrials, whatever you want to call them, they're here to strengthen, to protect their leader, who is the Antichrist. These entities, these non-human entities, are going to present themselves exactly the way they are physically. In other words, they're not going to camouflage themselves as human beings. No, they're going to be exactly like they are, exactly the way they are. These entities are going to tell us, they're going to welcome us, tell us that they're here to help us. Then they are going to introduce us to their headman, who will be the Antichrist. And then they will tell us, this is our elder brother who is going to save humanity. We must realize at this stage that we are facing a spiritual battle, and this is going to be a battle to the death. Everybody who is alive today in this world has the great privilege of living now through the apocalypse, through the full apocalypse. That's the huge privilege that we're all enjoying at this moment. Some people have the notion that the apocalypse is all about nuclear explosions happening every 5 minutes. No, it's not going to be like that. These non-human entities are going to say to all of us that Christ is their elder brother. And now we need to be very, very careful, because everybody is going to conclude that the Antichrist is in actual fact Christ himself. They will be absolutely delighted and thrilled with this, and they will follow him. The greater part of humanity will accept him as the true Christ himself. Be very, very careful with this. You need to be on your guard, because we'll be facing the greatest deception that humanity has ever been faced with. And very, very few people are going to realize that all of this is pure deception. The vast majority of people will accept this deception, sad to say. This is precisely why we need to be well informed, so that we'll be on our guard, waiting for these events to happen. But I have said it before, and I've said it lots of times in my videos. These entities are here. They have been here for hundreds of thousands of years already. They were here on this earth even before mankind ever existed. So be very careful about what we're about to go into and what we're about to live through, because we're not talking about years here. We're talking about a few months. Remember that, a few months. I really hope that this penetrates us and that we understand it. On the other hand, this is absolutely fascinating. It's fascinating to think that you're alive during the whole apocalypses. You're living the most passionate time of history. You're right in the middle of it. Even Christ himself, somewhere in the gospel, makes a mention of this. He says, many, he says, would have loved to have been alive at this time. It's absolutely amazing to think that we are protagonists that are living through the apocalypse. This has not happened for any other generation except ours. He goes from here to make a mention of how the actual jabs, these so-called vaccinations, are actually changing people's character at the moment, that he sees it in many of his own friends. He says these changes that he has noticed in them, they're radical changes. They're changing completely the way of thinking, their way of being, their behaviour. Everything seems to be changing about them. He says, yeah, we're living through all of these things, he says, which is fascinating in one aspect, he says, but on another level, it is terribly worrying when you look at things like this. He's then asked the question about the demolition of the Georgia Guidestones. He said people might like to think, he says, that it was some courageous people that took down these with some explosion. But he says, I prefer to think it wasn't. I believe, he says, it was the global elite who ordered that they be destroyed, because they now see themselves as completely obtaining their objectives. They're totally confident at this stage. Remember that they had a message printed on those guidestones that the human population be reduced to 500 million, 500 million in other words. So they're terribly confident at this stage that they will achieve their goals. And they're sending us a message. Listen, guys, we have you now completely under our control. You're doing exactly what we want and the way we want it done. He's then asked about the last Pope, Peter the Roman. Basically, he says that this Pope will guide and will strengthen the very small flock that will be left during the persecution of the Antichrist. But he doesn't think that this Pope will actually be one of, like in the classical mode, of going around dressed in white and saluting people, etc. In fact, he says it could well be an angel, or it could well be a lay person, but with a lot of charism, with a person with a lot of spiritual strength about them, that will actually help the people in the end times. He says it's quite difficult to give an opinion on this, really, because in the prophecy of St. Malachi, he doesn't actually have a number as such, which makes him suspect that it is indeed a non-classical pope, let's say. At this stage, Galeron returns to talking about the Antichrist. He says if the Antichrist were to appear now, humanity would pay him no attention whatsoever. They just scoff and laugh at him. So that is the reason that he will appear after the World War, because then humanity will be on its knees, demoralized, utterly depressed, having nothing left. They'll be absolutely desperate for a solution. And that is why they will be presented with this person who will solve all their problems. It is right in the middle of this demoralization of humanity when the global elite will announce to the people, look, we have this man here. We present him to you. And this man will be able to solve all the problems that now beset humanity. He is going to solve all our problems, all the wars we've always been having. He is going to solve the problem of famine and everything else with it. And it's at this point that humanity will accept him, because they will have no other choice. And really, let's not forget that he's a person, a very intelligent person, a very prepared and seemingly educated person. He will speak to people in their own language, which is a great thing to have. And he will speak your language very well, by the way. And most languages he will speak them. He's also going to be full of personality and very friendly, full of charisma, gifted. And it's logical, given that he's going to speak all these languages so well, that the people of the earth will identify with him very easily. The interviewer then poses the question that, as this Antichrist is to appear in June of next year, that means the war must start around October, November of this year, of 22. Galeron says, yes, he says it will start around that time. So it'll be from October, November until February, approximately. Or if you like, it will last during the European winter. In actual fact, somewhere in my documents I have read, because I distinctly remember it, I read where there would be a terrible European winter. Most likely it refers to this particular time period. Don't forget that the Russians have now turned off the gas and the oil. Galaron says as well that it's during this time that the European populations will start turning on their governments, and their governments will start to blame Putin for the freezing cold, given that they have no oil and they have no gas and the prices of everything has gone up, so they'll be all blaming Putin. But the people will realise at this time it's not Putin is the problem, it's they are the problem. The people will then begin to realise that it's the governments who have taken orders from the top and they have stopped the food supply getting through to the people. That it is also these very people who are pressurising Russia, that is the reason that Putin shut down the oil and the gas supplies to the nations in Europe. So things will be, the picture will start to make sense to the people at that stage. It's at this stage that the European people will go for the people that govern them, for their own governments, and they'll kill them. Because they know that they're the ones who are behind it all, not Putin. Pay great attention to Francis's journey to Russia, because he's going to travel there. And when he comes back, the rebellions will break out everywhere throughout Europe. Francis will be going to Russia. I don't think somehow he'll be going during the summer months. It could happen, for instance, maybe from September, October, sometime around then, because that's usually when politics resumes and the offices open up after the summer period. So it could be sometime around then. But when he comes back is when all the nations of Europe are going to go into open revolt. And we know this from the prophecies of Garabandal. It is around this time also that World War III will start, with the assassination of somebody very important. And it will give cause to the real commencement of World War III. Personally, I locate all of these happenings in the month of October and November, because in those months we have got 2 blood moons and a black moon. So definitely the red line for me are the months of October, November of this year. That is my red line. You will remember that before, in one of my videos, I predicted March 2020 as the start of the troubles based on blood moons. And that's exactly when COVID started. So from October and November onwards, the fun will start, because we'll have one event after the other. One event will hardly have finished and we'll already be starting another one. And that's the way it's going to continue from then on. He's then asked about the situation in Sri Lanka, where the people went into open revolt and burned down the house of the Prime Minister. He says what's happening there is going to happen in Europe, in the different states in Europe, and in the US also, because the people now are absolutely sick and fed up of everything that's going on, and they will take action. All of these governments, both in Europe and in America, are going to be toppled. They're going to be toppled by the people. And why is this going to happen? Because this is part of the global elite's plan for the people to topple the governments. Because it's at that point that they will take over. Given the absence of all governments, they'll take over and they'll present their candidate, in other words, the Antichrist, to the people. We can already see the start of this happening, of these governments being toppled. Boris Johnson is gone now. Macron is very shaky. Draghi in Italy is also shaky. And we could go on like this, but all of these governments will be toppled, and they'll all be toppled by the people eventually, creating a vacuum, and into that vacuum will come these global elite with their candidate and their world government, for which the people will vote and agree to. He's then asked the question, what can we do to protect ourselves in nuclear war? He says there's a German man, Ill Meyer, who actually wrote about that. He was a visionary and he wrote about it. He had tremendous vision of the Russian attack. He says all the countries, former Yugoslavia, Germany, Poland, Bulgaria, Romania, all of those countries will be absolutely devastated, completely devastated. Right up to France, loads of people dead. Most of England will disappear. This attack is also described in the Bible in chapters 38 and 39 of the prophet Ezekiel. The majority of the Spanish population will also be wiped out. About 30% of the Spanish population will be alive when this is over. When all of this is over, and all this destruction has been wrought on Europe, you're going to see huge immigration from Europe to America. Just as now you have many immigrants coming from African places into Europe. Well, when this nuclear war is over, the flow is going to be in the opposite direction. All the Europeans are going to start moving towards Central America and South America. He just goes back now to clarify a fact that one of the viewers actually brought up, and it's about these non-human entities, or these extraterrestrials, if you like. Call them what you like. He says there are thousands and thousands of these races in the whole universe. But all of them, he says, they're all under the control of Satan. He says some of them are not too bad, but the worst of them, he says, would be the Anunnakis. He's asked two more questions, but they're not of great significance, so I won't bother with those. And they're more relevant to Colombia. So that's the end of that.